Okay, class, last week and this week you were to read poetry and analyze poems. And if you thought that the literature that we read, the short stories that we read were hard, I'm sure that this seems even harder to do, which is part of the reason why it's in the second series of analysis. So analyzing poems is a little bit trickier because there is a lot said in a very little bit of time, but there's a lot of allusion. So there's things that allude to things. There's a lot of symbolic meaning in poetry, and language and imagery have a lot to do with poetry and understanding poetry as well. So what I want to do is talk about a little bit of the ways that we can analyze poetry, and then also talk specifically about some of the poems that you read last week and this week. So in terms of analyzing poems, there was a handout that you had from last week that talked about the elements of a poem, and it could be found, that handout was actually from the Al Purdue, the Online Writing Lab for Purdue University. And there are 5 different things to look at, and I'm going to add a 6th one. I didn't put it on here, but I did on the poems that we're going to talk about. And that's basically finding things that resonate with us, that kind of ring true to life, or just some other things to consider. So one of the things you want to look at is, what is the theme of the poem? So most of the poems, or even like any type of literature, there's a theme that runs throughout the piece. And there can be many themes. Is the poem about love? Is it about death? Is it about war, peace, or something else? And several of these themes were covered in the different poems that you've read. And then genre. Genre can make a difference. Is it an ode? Is it a sonnet? So a sonnet's usually, Shakespeare did a lot of sonnets. It has a lot of rhyme and meter in sonnet. A lot of love poems are done in sonnet. Is it satire? So is it something that is supposed to be parodying something else? Is it an elegy? Is it something that is paying homage to something? Is it lyrical? Verification, does it have rhyme and meter, and what kind of rhyme and meter, and how is that significant? And poetry uses a lot of rhyme and meter. I mean, there is free verse where there's not rhyme involved in it, but the thing with poetry is the language can create meaning, it can create beauty, it can also create, there's cacophony where there can be kind of harsh sounds. And as we analyze the poem that you read on The Charge of the Light Brigade, the meter in that and word choice is symbolic of battle, gives you the feeling of a battle. We'll talk about that when we look at that poem. And then figures of speech. So this would be the imagery. Is there a metaphor that something is something else compared to something else, that it resembles something else? That's usually the opposite of what it is. Or is it a simile, and that's where you use like or as to make comparisons? Or is there a metonymy? One thing stands for something else that is closely related to it. So, for example, using the word the crown to refer to the king. Or is there synecdoche? The part stands for the whole. All hands on deck, where hands means people. Is there personification, where you take something that's an inanimate object and give it qualities that are for a living person? And I'm not sure how to say this, litotes, I think. A double negative is used for poetic effect. And then irony. And then also looking at cultural context. Does a historical context have significance? So in the poem Home Burial, there are things that are very significant. So I actually want to talk more about this, and we're going to run out of time. So I'm going to stop the recording here, and then I'll do another recording to talk about Home Burial in more details. Okay, class, tonight I want to share with you some ideas on analyzing poetry. I know that poetry and analyzing a poem can be very difficult, especially because there's a lot of imagery that can be used. Poetry, imagery and the beauty of the language and meter, all of those things have meaning. And so you have to kind of understand that meaning and kind of decode that meaning so that you can fully understand it. So that's what I want to take a few minutes to do with you during this video. You had a handout, I think it was part of last week's reading materials, by the Al Purdue, which stands for the Online Writing Lab through Purdue University, and you've probably used some of their resources before. And there was a handout on how to understand a poem. And so I want to talk about some of the elements of a poem which that handout talks about. So a poem often has a theme, and it can have more than one theme, but typically it has one predominant theme. It can be about love, it can be about death, war, peace, or something else. And the poems that we read last week and this week some of them did talk about love, some of them talked about, I don't know if they talked really about love, but there was death, there was war, and there are other things, and we'll talk about some of those other themes. And then genre is also important in understanding a poem and its significance. So is it an ode? Is it a sonnet? A sonnet is usually a Shakespearean sonnet, and it has a particular rhyme pattern to it, and a particular meter that happens in a sonnet. And oftentimes sonnets are love poems. Is it a satire? So is it something that is mocking? Is it a parody? Or is it an elegy? Is it something that's paying homage to something? Is it lyrical? Do the words matter? And we know even in music with lyrics that they definitely can have staying power and have significance. And then verification, the rhyme and meter, how is that significant? One of the poems that you read for this week, the Charge of the Light Brigade, it actually had a certain meter, and the meter and word choice actually built up to the idea of a battle. You got the idea that they were really in a battle based on the short clipped words and the meter. So we'll talk about that. And then figures of speech. Figures of speech is very important in poetry, especially because most of it, there's not a lot of words, and so the words have to say a lot, and that's done through imagery. So is it a metaphor? So a metaphor basically says that something is something else, and it's usually comparing two things that are unlike and showing how they're alike. And then a simile, and that's similar to a metaphor, but it uses the words like or as for comparison. And the metonymy, one thing stands for something else that is closely related to it. So for example, the crown can refer to the king. Or is it synecdoche? A part stands for the whole. All hands on deck. Hands means people. Is there personification? So are they giving something that's an inanimate object words that have to do with a person? Are litotes, a double negative, is used for poetic effect? Or is there irony? And we're going to see that in some of the poetry that we talk about today. And then also cultural context. Does the historical context have significance? And then some of the poems, they really do. And then finally, there's a sixth element. I didn't add it to the slide, but we will be talking about that sixth element. And the sixth element has to do with where does it resonate with real life? Where can you make real life connections? And so we'll talk about that. I'm going to go ahead and cut this part of the slide short because I only have these in 5-minute increments, and I want to speak to you more. We're going to go right into the first poem, and so I'll stop the recording here and then we'll move on to the next one.